Get this man off my plane, now. Andrea Whitmore slammed her palm on the armrest, her face twisted with rage, pointing directly at the black man sitting quietly in seat 2A. I will not fly with someone like him in first class. Call the police. Call them right now. Every passenger froze, every head turned, and the man she was pointing at, a retired Navy SEAL who had bled for this country on battlefields most people couldn't even find on a map, didn't say a single word. He just looked at her. What happened next brought an entire airplane to tears, and it all started because one woman couldn't believe a black man deserved to sit next to her. If this story moves you, I'm asking you right now, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. Let me see just how far this story travels. The morning of November 14th started like any other Tuesday for Jacob Cash. He woke up at 04:30 the way he had for the past 26 years. His body didn't need an alarm. It never had. The discipline was carved into his bones, etched by decades of military training that most civilians couldn't survive a single week of. He brushed his teeth, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at his reflection for a long moment. There were new lines around his eyes. His temples had gone gray, but his posture was still ramrod straight, and the look in his eyes still carried the kind of quiet authority that made people either respect him immediately or feel deeply uncomfortable. He grabbed his duffel bag, the same worn-out green bag he'd carried through 3 combat deployments, and headed for the door. "You got your boarding pass?" his wife Denise called from the kitchen. "Yes, ma'am," Jacob said, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "And your ID?" "Denise, I packed everything last night." "I know you did. I'm still asking." He walked back to her and kissed her forehead. She grabbed his hand and held it for a moment. "Come home safe," she whispered. It was what she always said. Even now, years after the battlefield, she still said it every time he walked out the door. "Always," he replied. Jacob Cash was 53 years old. He'd served 24 years in the United States Navy, 14 of those as a SEAL. He'd been deployed to Afghanistan 3 times, Iraq twice, and had carried out classified operations in countries he still wasn't allowed to name. He had a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a left knee that ached every time it rained because of a piece of shrapnel that surgeons decided was safer to leave inside him than to pull out. He was flying from Norfolk, Virginia, to San Diego, California, to speak at a veterans' mental health conference. The organizers had booked him a first-class ticket. He hadn't asked for it. He never asked for anything. But they insisted, and Denise told him to stop being so stubborn and just accept the kindness. So here he was, walking through Norfolk International Airport at 6 in the morning, duffel over one shoulder, boarding pass on his phone, wearing a simple black polo shirt and dark jeans. No uniform, no medals. Nothing that announced who he was or what he'd done. Jacob had never been the kind of man who needed the world to know his story. He carried it quietly the way he carried everything. He passed through security without incident, nodded politely at the TSA agent, who thanked him for something she couldn't quite identify, and made his way to Gate B7. The terminal was busy, but not packed. Business travelers mostly, a few families, a college kid sleeping across 3 chairs with a backpack as a pillow. Jacob found a seat near the window and pulled out a small leather journal. He'd been writing in journals since his first deployment. His therapist at the VA had suggested it years ago, and it stuck. He wrote about dreams, memories, things he was grateful for. Sometimes just single words that described how he felt. Today, he wrote one word: steady. He closed the journal when the boarding announcement came. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are now beginning priority boarding for Flight 4721 with service to San Diego. First-class passengers and active military personnel may board at this time." Jacob stood up, tucked his journal into his bag, and walked toward the gate. He handed his phone to the gate agent, who scanned the pass and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Cash. Thank you for flying with us." "Thank you," he said, and walked down the jetway. The plane was a Boeing 737, clean and quiet. First class had 12 seats arranged in rows of 2 on each side. Jacob found his seat to a window side left row. He stowed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, buckled his seatbelt, and looked out the window at the tarmac below. For about 4 minutes, the world was peaceful. Then Andrea Whitmore walked onto the plane. She came in like a woman who had been told her entire life that every room she entered belonged to her. Her heels clicked with purpose. Her designer handbag was clutched against her chest like a shield. She wore a cream-colored blazer and gold earrings that caught the overhead light. Her eyes swept the first-class cabin the way a landlord surveys property, checking to make sure everything was exactly where it should be. She stopped at row 2, seat 2B, right next to Jacob. She looked at her boarding pass, then she looked at him. Then she looked at her boarding pass again, her lips pressed together into a thin, hard line. She didn't sit down. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough that the flight attendant 3 rows ahead turned around. "Excuse me, is there a problem with the seating?" A flight attendant named Grace, mid-30s, professional and composed, walked over immediately. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" Andrea gestured toward Jacob with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Is this man supposed to be sitting here?" Grace glanced at Jacob, then back at Andrea. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Could you clarify what you mean? I mean, is he in the right seat? This is first class." Jacob turned his head slowly. He looked at Andrea, not with anger, not with surprise, with the calm, measured gaze of a man who had been underestimated more times than he could count and had learned long ago that silence was the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. "Ma'am, I'm sure all our passengers are in their correct seats," Grace said, her voice polite but firm. "Can I help you get settled?" Andrea didn't move. She stared at Jacob as though his very presence was an offense. "I'd like to see his boarding pass." The cabin went still. Not silent, but that particular kind of still where every ear tunes in, even though every eye pretends to look away. Grace's smile held, but there was a tension behind it now. "Ma'am, I'm not able to ask another passenger to show you their boarding pass. That's a privacy matter. If you'd like to take your seat, I'm happy to help you with your luggage." "I'm not sitting next to him." She said it like that. Not next to him. Jacob's jaw tightened. Just barely. A fraction of a movement that no one would have noticed unless they knew what to look for. But he said nothing. He turned back to the window. Grace took a breath. "Ma'am, if you have a concern, I can speak with the lead flight attendant, but I assure you, every passenger in this cabin has a valid ticket for their assigned seat. Then get your lead, because something is wrong here. I fly this airline 4 times a month. I've never seen someone like him up here." Someone like him. The words landed in the cabin like a grenade with the pin pulled. A businessman in row 3 lowered his newspaper. A woman across the aisle in 1B stopped scrolling on her phone. 2 rows back, a teenager named Rob Donovan looked up from his headphones and stared. Grace kept her composure, but her eyes flickered with something she was clearly working hard to contain. "I'll get the lead flight attendant for you, ma'am. One moment." She walked toward the front of the cabin. Andrea still hadn't sat down. She stood in the aisle, blocking anyone behind her from moving forward. Her arms crossed, her chin raised. Jacob opened his journal. He uncapped his pen, and he wrote another word beneath steady: patience. 30 seconds later, the lead flight attendant arrived. His name was Marcus, a tall man in his 40s with graying temples and the kind of voice that could calm a room just by speaking. He approached Andrea with an easy smile. "Good morning, ma'am. I understand there might be a concern. How can I assist you today?" "Yes, this man," she pointed at Jacob again, openly in front of everyone, "does not belong in first class. I want him moved or I want security." Marcus looked at Jacob. Jacob looked back at him and gave a single slow nod, the kind of nod that said, "I'm not the problem here, and we both know it." "Sir, would you mind if I see your boarding pass, just to help resolve this quickly?" "Not at all," Jacob said. His voice was deep, calm, and measured. He pulled out his phone, opened the airline app, and showed his boarding pass. Seat 2A, first class, paid in full. His name, Jacob T. Cash, right there on the screen. Marcus looked at it, then looked at Andrea. "Ma'am, this gentleman has a valid first-class ticket for seat 2A. Everything is in order." "I don't care what his phone says. I want to see a physical ID. How do I know that's even his ticket? Someone could have given it to him." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Ma'am, I can assure you that our boarding process verifies every passenger's identity at the gate. Mr. Cash boarded with a valid ticket and valid identification. I want security." "Ma'am, I really don't think that's necessary." "I said I want security. Are you going to call them or do I need to call the police myself?" She already had her phone out. Her thumb was hovering over the screen. She wasn't bluffing. Marcus held up his hand. "Ma'am, please. Let me make a call. Just give me a moment." He stepped to the front of the cabin and picked up the intercom phone. The conversation was brief and quiet, but every passenger heard the words, "Security request at gate B7. Jacob Cash closed his journal. He placed it on his lap. He folded his hands over it. And he waited. The way he had waited in foxholes, the way he had waited on rooftops in Fallujah with a rifle in his hands and nothing but patience between him and the enemy, the way he had waited in hospital beds while doctors told him he might never walk right again. He waited because that is what warriors do. They don't waste energy on people who don't deserve it. 3 rows behind him, a woman named Jane Boston was watching everything. Jane was 51 years old, a civil rights attorney out of Washington, D.C., and she had been practicing law for 23 years. She had seen this kind of thing before, in courtrooms, in restaurants, in airports. And every single time, it made her blood boil the same way it did the first time. She pulled out her phone and began recording, quietly, discreetly. Not to make a scene, but to make a record. Because Jane knew from decades of experience that when things like this happened, the truth had a way of getting rewritten by the people who caused the harm. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. Beside her sat Gerald Hutchins, 72 years old, a retired high school history teacher from Richmond. Gerald had marched with his parents during the civil rights movement when he was a boy. He'd seen dogs and fire hoses turned on people whose only crime was wanting to be treated as human beings. He recognized the look on Andrea's face because he had seen it on 100 faces before hers. Different decade, same hatred. Gerald leaned over to Jane and whispered, "You getting this?" "Every second," Jane whispered back. The security officers arrived within 3 minutes. 2 men, both in airport police uniforms, walked down the aisle with the calm efficiency of professionals who handled these calls multiple times a day. The taller one, Officer Rivera, approached first. "Good morning. We received a report of a disturbance. Can someone tell me what's going on?" Andrea stepped forward immediately. "This man," she pointed at Jacob for the 3rd time, "is in a seat he doesn't belong in. I've asked the crew to remove him and they've refused. I feel unsafe." Officer Rivera looked at Jacob. "Sir, good morning. Do you have your ID and boarding pass handy?" "Yes, sir." Jacob reached into his bag slowly, deliberately, the way a man who understood the stakes of sudden movements had trained himself to do. He pulled out his military ID and his phone with the boarding pass. He handed both to the officer with steady hands. Rivera looked at the ID. He looked at the boarding pass. He looked at the ID again. Then he looked at his partner and something passed between them, a recognition, a shift. "Mr. Cash," Rivera said, and there was a new weight in his voice. "Thank you for your service, sir." "Thank you, officer." Rivera turned to Andrea. "Ma'am, this gentleman has a valid first-class ticket and a valid military identification card. He is a retired Navy SEAL. There is no issue here." The cabin held its breath. Andrea blinked. Then she shook her head. "That doesn't change anything. I don't feel safe. I want him moved." "Ma'am, we can't remove a passenger who has a valid ticket and has done nothing wrong. He's done something wrong by being here. Look at him." She said it out loud, in front of everyone. Look at him, as if his appearance, his skin, his mere existence was evidence of a crime. Gerald Hutchins took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He'd heard those exact words before, 60 years ago. Different airport, different woman, same poison. Rob Donovan, the teenager in row 4, pulled out his earbuds completely. He had never witnessed anything like this in his 18 years of life. He looked at Jacob, and what he saw wasn't a man who looked dangerous. He saw a man who looked like someone's father, someone's grandfather, someone who had done something meaningful with his life. And he saw a woman trying to destroy that man for no reason at all. "This ain't right," Rob muttered under his breath. The older woman next to him, a stranger, nodded slowly. "No, it is not." Officer Rivera tried one more time. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to take your seat. The gentleman is not a threat. There is no safety concern. If you'd like, we can help you rebook on another flight." "Rebook? I have a meeting in San Diego at noon. I'm not rebooking anything. He should rebook." Jacob spoke for the first time since the officers arrived. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He simply turned in his seat and looked directly at Andrea. "Ma'am," he said, "I've spent 24 years defending this country. I've been shot at. I've been blown up. I've held dying men in my arms and told them they were going to be okay when I knew they weren't. I bought this ticket the same way you bought yours. I earned this seat the same way I earned everything I have. I don't know what you see when you look at me, but whatever it is, that's your problem, not mine." The cabin didn't applaud. No one cheered. But the silence that followed his words was more powerful than any standing ovation. It was the silence of recognition, of shame, of people looking at themselves and asking hard questions they might not have the courage to answer. Andrea's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around the cabin, expecting allies, expecting someone to back her up, to validate her. but every face she met turned away or stared back at her with something she had never experienced in her carefully curated life. Judgment. She looked at Officer Rivera. "I want to file a complaint." "You're welcome to do that, ma'am. You can file it at the customer service desk inside the terminal. But right now, you need to either take your seat or deplane. This isn't over." Andrea said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with the fury of a person losing control of a situation they believed they owned. She sat down. Hard. She shoved her bag under the seat in front of her and turned her entire body away from Jacob, pressing herself against the armrest on the aisle side, as if even the air between them was contaminated. Jacob turned back to the window. He picked up his pen. He opened his journal, and beneath steady and patience, he wrote one more word: dignity. The plane continued boarding. Passengers filed in, some stepping over the residual tension, others absorbing it. Marcus, the lead attendant, walked back through the cabin, checking on passengers, and when he reached Jacob's row, he leaned down. "Mr. Cash, I want to apologize on behalf of the crew and the airline. That should not have happened." "You don't need to apologize," Jacob said quietly. "You handled it well. Can I get you anything, water, coffee?" "A coffee would be nice. Black, no sugar." "Coming right up, sir." As Marcus walked away, Andrea turned her head just slightly. Not enough to look at Jacob, but enough to listen. She heard Marcus's respectful tone. She saw the flight attendant's posture, the deference, the quiet acknowledgement that the man beside her was owed something she hadn't given him. And something shifted in her chest. Not remorse, not yet, but the first crack in the armor, the first splinter of awareness that maybe, just maybe, she had made a terrible mistake. But Andrea Whitmore was not a woman who admitted mistakes easily. She had built her entire life on the belief that her instincts were right, that her worldview was correct, and that people like her occupied their positions for a reason. To admit she was wrong wouldn't just mean apologizing to a stranger. It would mean questioning everything she believed about herself. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The coffee arrived. Jacob wrapped his hands around the warm cup and took a slow sip. Behind him, Jane Boston was still recording. Gerald Hutchins was shaking his head, lost in memories he wished the world had outgrown. Rob Donovan was texting his mother, "Mom, you won't believe what just happened on this plane." And somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Agustin Gusto was going through his pre-flight checklist, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed through his cabin. He didn't know yet, but he would. And when he found out everything was about to change, the overhead bins clicked shut one by one. The cabin door was still open, but not for long. And the most important moment of this flight hadn't happened yet. It was coming. The cabin door was still open, but the air inside that plane had already changed. You could feel it, that invisible weight pressing down on every passenger who had watched Andrea Whitmore humiliate a man she didn't know for a crime he didn't commit. Some people shifted in their seats. Others pretended to read magazines they weren't actually reading. But nobody forgot what they saw. Nobody could. Jacob took another sip of his coffee. Black, no sugar. The cup was warm between his hands, and he held it the way a man holds something steady when the world around him is trying to shake him loose. His eyes stayed on the window, watching the ground crew load luggage onto the conveyor belt below. Ordinary work. Ordinary morning. He envied them for a moment. Nobody was questioning whether they deserved to be there. Andrea sat rigid in 2B, her body angled so far toward the aisle that she was practically sitting sideways. She hadn't looked at Jacob since sitting down. Her jaw was clenched. Her hands gripped the armrests like she was bracing for turbulence that hadn't come yet. But the turbulence wasn't outside. It was inside her. She could feel the eyes, every set of them, burning into the back of her head, the side of her face, the space she occupied. She had never been looked at like this before, not once in her 58 years. She pulled out her phone and started typing furiously, a text to someone, maybe her husband, maybe her lawyer, maybe no one. Maybe she just needed her fingers to move so she could pretend she was in control of something. 3 rows back, Jane Boston lowered her phone but kept the camera ready. She leaned toward Gerald Hutchins and whispered, "She's texting, probably building her version of events already." Gerald nodded slowly. "They always do. The story changes before the plane even takes off." "Not this time," Jane said. "I got every second." Gerald looked at her. "You think it'll matter?" "It has to." In row 4, Rob Donovan was still processing what he'd witnessed. He was 18 years old. He'd grown up in a suburb outside of Charlotte where his parents told him everyone was equal and the world was getting better. He believed them. He wanted to believe them. But what he just saw didn't match the world his parents described. It matched something uglier, something he thought only existed in documentaries and history textbooks. He leaned forward and looked at the back of Jacob's head. The man hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done a single thing wrong, and Rob felt something twist in his stomach that he couldn't name yet but would carry with him for a very long time. His phone buzzed. His mother replied, "What happened? Are you okay?" He typed back, "I'm fine, but this man isn't, and nobody's doing anything." He stared at the words before sending them. Then he deleted the last sentence and typed something else. "Actually, he's doing everything. He's just sitting there, and that might be the bravest thing I've ever seen." Up front, Marcus was in the galley talking quietly with Grace. Their voices were low, but their faces said everything. She threw his bag, Marcus. She physically threw it. "I know. That's assault. That's not just being rude. She put her hands on his property, on a federal aircraft." Marcus rubbed his temples. "I've already documented everything. I'll file the report the second we land." "The second we land? What about right now?" "Right now, I need this plane to push back on time. The captain doesn't even know what happened yet." Grace stared at him. "You haven't told the captain." "He's been running pre-flight checks. I didn't want to pull him out for something I thought we had under control." "Marcus." The woman accused a decorated veteran of stealing a seat because of the color of his skin. She threw his belongings into the aisle. Security had to come on board. In what universe is this under control? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened his tie, took a breath, and picked up the intercom phone that connected directly to the cockpit. "Captain Gusto, this is Marcus. We need to speak before pushback." The response came quickly, a deep, steady voice with a trace of authority that didn't need volume to command attention. "On my way." Grace looked at Marcus. "What do you think he's going to do?" "I don't know, but I've flown with Gusto for 3 years. He doesn't let things like this slide." In the cockpit, Captain Agustin Gusto unclipped his harness and stood up. He was 61 years old, built like a man who still woke up early to run 5 miles every morning. His hair was silver, his mustache neatly trimmed, and his eyes carried the kind of depth that comes from seeing both the best and worst of what human beings are capable of. He had served 20 years in the United States Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. He'd flown C-130s into combat zones. He'd evacuated wounded soldiers under fire. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission he still didn't talk about at dinner parties. Agustin Gusto knew exactly what military service cost a man, and he knew exactly what it meant when someone tried to strip that man of his dignity. He stepped out of the cockpit and into the galley where Marcus and Grace were waiting. "Talk to me," he said. Marcus told him everything: the accusation, the demand, the thrown bag, the security call, the military ID, the woman who still hadn't apologized and was sitting in 2B texting on her phone like nothing happened. Gusto listened without interrupting. His face didn't change, his posture didn't shift, but his eyes did something. They hardened, not with anger, with resolve. "What's the veteran's name?" he asked. "Jacob Cash, retired Navy SEAL, 24 years of service." Gusto repeated the name quietly, almost to himself. "Jacob Cash." He looked at Marcus. "And the woman, Andrea Whitmore, frequent flyer, platinum status." "Platinum status," Gusto repeated. The way he said it made it sound like the most meaningless phrase in the English language. He adjusted his captain's hat, he straightened his jacket, and he walked into the cabin. Every set of eyes turned to him. When a captain walks out of the cockpit before a flight passenger's notice, it's unusual. It means something. And in this moment, every person on that plane felt the shift. Something was about to happen. Gusto walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately. He didn't rush. He didn't scan the rows. He walked like a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was going to do when he got there. He stopped at row 2. Andrea looked up from her phone. For the first time since the incident began, something flickered across her face that wasn't anger. It was uncertainty, because the captain of the aircraft was standing in the aisle looking directly at her row, and she couldn't tell if he was there for her or for him. Gusto turned to Jacob. "Mr. Cash." Jacob looked up. "Yes, sir." "I'm Captain Gusto. I'm the pilot in command of this aircraft." "Good morning, Captain." Gusto looked at him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Jacob took it. The handshake was firm. 2 men who understood each other without needing words. 2 men who had served. 2 men who knew what sacrifice meant. "Marcus tells me you're a retired SEAL, 24 years. "That's correct, sir." "What teams do 3 and 7? Gusto's eyebrows rose, just slightly. Anyone who knew anything about special operations knew what SEAL Team 3 and SEAL Team 7 meant. These weren't desk assignments, these were the sharpest edges of the American military. "I flew resupply into Kandahar in '03, Gusto said. "Supported SEAL operations on the ground. It's possible I flew missions for your team." Jacob looked at him with new recognition. "C-130Os. That's right. Then you probably did, sir. We couldn't have done our jobs without those flights." Gusto held Jacob's gaze for another moment. Then he did something that no one on that plane expected. Not Jacob, not Andrea, not Jane with her recording phone, or Gerald with his memories, or Rob with his wide young eyes. Captain Agustin Gusto took one step back. He squared his shoulders, he brought his heels together, and he raised his right hand to his brow in a crisp, perfect military salute. He held it. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. The silence in that cabin was so absolute you could hear the air cycling through the ventilation system. 10 seconds. Jacob's eyes changed. The stoic mask he'd been wearing since Andrea first pointed at him shifted. His lower lip trembled. Not much, just enough. He stood up slowly, carefully, and returned the salute with the precision of a man who had rendered that gesture thousands of times, but had never felt it this deeply. They held the salute together, 2 veterans, 2 men who had been part of the same war from different altitudes, one on the ground, one in the sky, both carrying scars that civilian life would never fully understand. Gusto dropped his hand first, then Jacob. They looked at each other and something passed between them that didn't need language. It was older than language. It was the bond of men who had risked everything and lost people they loved in the process. "Mr. Cash," Gusto said loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, "on behalf of this crew, this airline, and this aircraft, I want to thank you for your service to this country. You are welcome in this cabin. You are welcome on every flight I ever command. And I want you to know that every person on this plane is safer because men like you exist." The cabin didn't erupt. There was no applause. Not yet. Instead, there was something more powerful. There were tears, Gerald Hutchins. 72 years old, a man who had seen the worst of American history and fought to change it, pressed his hand over his mouth and wept, quietly, without shame. Because he had waited his entire life to see something like this, and it was happening 3 rows in front of him. Jane Boston lowered her phone, not because she stopped recording, but because her hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. Rob Donovan wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie and looked away from the window so nobody would see. But the woman next to him saw, and she put her hand on his arm and squeezed it gently because sometimes a stranger's kindness is the only thing that keeps you from falling apart. And Andrea Whitmore sat frozen. Her phone had gone dark in her hands. She stared straight ahead, her face completely blank, as though the world she had constructed around herself, the walls of entitlement and assumption and superiority, had just been demolished in 15 seconds by a man in a pilot's uniform who simply told the truth. Gusto turned to her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand there was a complaint." Andrea opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "I want you to know," Gusto continued, "that Mr. Cash is a guest of honor on this flight. He has served this nation at the highest levels of the United States military. He has bled for the freedoms that allow every single one of us to sit on this aircraft, including you." Andrea's lips moved. A whisper. "I didn't know." "No, ma'am, you didn't. And that's the problem. You didn't know, but you assumed, and your assumption put this man through an experience he never should have had to endure. Not today, not ever." She blinked rapidly. Her eyes were glistening, but the tears hadn't fallen yet. She was fighting them, holding them back with everything she had, because Andrea Whitmore did not cry in public. Andrea Whitmore did not lose. Andrea Whitmore did not get lectured by a pilot in front of an entire cabin of strangers. But today, Andrea Whitmore was not in control. And for the first time in her life, she knew it. Gusto straightened his jacket. He looked around the cabin. Every face stared back at him, some with gratitude, some with emotion, some with the quiet recognition that they had just witnessed something they would carry for the rest of their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we're going to have a smooth flight today. We'll be pushing back shortly. I want to remind everyone that we're all sharing this space together, and the only thing I require from every person on this aircraft is basic human decency. That's not a suggestion. That's a requirement." He looked at Jacob one more time. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Cash." "Thank you, Captain." Gusto walked back toward the cockpit. His footsteps were the only sound in the cabin. When he reached the cockpit door, he paused. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there for a moment, his hand on the doorframe, as if reminding himself why he still did this job after all these years. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The cabin exhaled, collectively, like a single organism releasing a breath it didn't know it was holding. Passengers looked at each other. Some nodded, some smiled, some just sat with whatever was moving through them and let it happen. Marcus stepped back into the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be closing the cabin doors shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your personal items are stowed." He walked past Jacob's row and paused just long enough to place a fresh cup of coffee on his tray table. Black, no sugar, no words, just the cup, just the gesture. Jacob looked up at him and nodded. That was enough. Andrea hadn't moved. She was staring at her hands. Her phone sat dark in her lap. The text she had been writing felt meaningless now. Whatever story she had been constructing, whatever version of events she had been preparing to tell her husband, or her friends, or her lawyer, it had been obliterated by the truth. And the truth was still ringing in her ears. She turned her head, just slightly, just enough to see Jacob's profile. The strong jaw, the steady eyes, the hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. On his left hand, a wedding ring. Simple, gold, worn from years of use. This man had a wife, a life, a home. He wasn't a threat, he never was. And somewhere deep inside the architecture of Andrea's belief system, a wall began to crumble. She looked away quickly. The tears she had been fighting finally escaped. One, then another. She wiped them with the back of her hand and turned toward the window. She didn't have pressing herself into the aisle seat as if she could disappear into it. Gerald Hutchins watched her from row 5. He recognized those tears. He'd seen them before on the faces of people who suddenly realized they had been standing on the wrong side of history. It didn't make them good people. Not yet. But it meant the door wasn't completely closed. He leaned back in his seat and whispered something so quietly that only he could hear it. Maybe there's still time. Maybe there's... The cabin door closed with a heavy mechanical thud. The jetway pulled back. The safety demonstration began, but nobody was watching it. Every mind on that plane was somewhere else. Somewhere between what just happened and what it meant. The engines powered up. The plane lurched forward, beginning its slow taxi toward the runway. Jacob Cash placed his coffee in the cup holder, opened his journal, and turned to a fresh page. He stared at the blank white paper for a long time. Then he uncapped his pen. He wrote 4 words. Still here, still standing. The plane accelerated down the runway, and the ground fell away beneath them. They were airborne. And whatever was going to happen next, there was no turning back. 37,000 feet above the earth, the cabin settled into the hum of cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Passengers shifted, stretched, pulled out laptops and books and headphones. But nobody in first class moved the way people normally move on a Tuesday morning flight. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with cabin pressure. Every person in those 12 seats was still carrying what they had witnessed on the ground, and the altitude hadn't diluted it one bit. Jacob Cash kept his journal open on the tray table, but hadn't written anything new since takeoff. His pen rested between his fingers, rolling slightly with the vibration of the aircraft. He wasn't reading. He wasn't sleeping. He was doing something he had learned to do in combat zones when the mission was over, but the adrenaline hadn't faded yet. He was letting his body come down, slowly, deliberately, breath by breath. His phone was in airplane mode, tucked into the seat pocket. Denise wouldn't hear from him until he landed. She'd worry. She always worried. But she also trusted him to handle whatever came his way because she had watched him handle things that would have broken most people, and he was still here, still whole, still the man she married. 2 seats away, Andrea Whitmore hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Her hands were in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the seat back in front of her. The texts she'd been composing before the captain's intervention were still unsent, sitting in draft form on a dark screen. She'd written 3 different versions of what happened. In the first, she was the victim. In the second, she was misunderstood. In the third, she'd deleted everything and just typed her husband's name, Richard, followed by a period. She hadn't sent any of them. Something was happening inside Andrea that she didn't have the vocabulary for. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. Guilt requires an admission of wrongdoing, and Andrea hadn't gotten there yet. It was closer to exposure. The feeling of being seen for exactly what you are by a room full of strangers who will never forget your face. She had spent her entire adult life constructing an image of herself as reasonable, intelligent, and fair. In 15 minutes, that image had been shattered in front of 40 witnesses, and a cockpit full of crew members, and no amount of texting was going to put it back together. Grace, the flight attendant, passed through the first-class cabin with a beverage cart. She stopped at each row with her professional smile, the one she'd perfected over 11 years of flying. When she reached row 2, she looked at Jacob first. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Cash? Another coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." She turned to Andrea. "Ma'am, anything to drink?" Andrea didn't look up. "No." Grace paused for half a second longer than necessary, not to judge, not to punish, but because she was a human being who had watched another human being do something ugly, and the residue of that moment was still on her skin. She moved on without a word. In row 5, Gerald Hutchins was having a conversation with himself, not out loud. Inside, the way old men do when the present moment triggers something buried so deep they thought it was gone. He was thinking about 1963. He was thinking about a bus station in Alabama where his father, a Baptist minister, was told he couldn't use the restroom because of his skin color. Gerald was 9 years old. He watched his father stand there holding his hand, saying nothing, his jaw set in that same rigid line he'd seen on Jacob's face today. His father didn't yell, didn't argue. He just turned around and walked away. And 9-year-old Gerald thought his father was the strongest man in the world. He still did. Gerald reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He pressed it against his eyes and took a slow, shaking breath. The woman in the seat next to him, a stranger whose name he didn't know, touched his elbow gently. "You okay?" she asked. "I will be," Gerald said. "Just reminded me of someone." "Someone good. The best man I ever knew." She nodded and didn't ask anything else. Sometimes that's all a person needs. Not answers, just someone to sit beside them while the memories do their work. Jane Boston had stopped recording after the captain returned to the cockpit, but the footage was saved. 14 minutes and 23 seconds. She had watched it back once already right after takeoff with her earbuds in, and the brightness turned low. It was clear. The audio was crisp. Andrea's words, every single one of them, were captured in high definition. Jacob's response measured and devastating. The captain's salute, all of it. Jane was a civil rights attorney. She had spent 23 years fighting cases involving discrimination, profiling, and civil liberties violations. She knew what this footage was worth. Not in money, in truth, in accountability, in the kind of evidence that changes policies and ends careers and forces institutions to look at themselves in a mirror they've been avoiding. But she also knew something else. She knew that what she did with this video would affect a real man, Jacob Cash, a man who clearly didn't want attention, a man who wrote in a journal and drank black coffee and responded to hatred with words so precise they could cut glass. Releasing this video without his consent would be a violation of a different kind, and Jane was not in the business of using people's pain without their permission. She closed her phone and made a decision. She would talk to him before they landed. Before she did anything, she would ask. 40 minutes into the flight, something unexpected happened. Rob Donovan stood up from row 4. He was wearing a gray hoodie, basketball shorts, and sneakers that had seen better days. His hair was messy. His eyes were red. He looked exactly like what he was, an 18-year-old kid who had just watched something that rewired the way he understood the world. He walked forward, past row 3, past the businessman who had lowered his newspaper and never picked it back up, past the woman in 1B who was pretending to sleep but wasn't. He stopped at row 2. Jacob looked up. "Excuse me, sir," Rob said. His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me, son." Rob swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say what you said back there about earning your seat and defending this country. That was the most real thing I've ever heard anyone say. And I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm really sorry." Jacob studied the young man's face. He saw the sincerity, the discomfort, the courage it took to walk up to a stranger on an airplane and say something that mattered. And something in Jacob's chest loosened. Not much, but enough. "What's your name?" Jacob asked. Rob Donovan." "Where you headed, Rob?" "San Diego, starting at SDSU in January." "Good school. What are you studying?" "I don't know yet. Maybe criminal justice. Maybe history. I can't decide." Jacob smiled. It was the first real smile he'd shown since boarding. "You've got time. Don't rush it." Rob nodded. Then he said something he hadn't planned to say. It just came out of him like water breaking through a crack in a dam. "My dad's a cop, back in Charlotte, and he always told me that you judge a man by what he does, not what he looks like. I believed him, but I never really understood it until today. I watched you sit there and not lose your cool when every person in this cabin would have lost theirs, and I just want you to know I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life." Jacob's eyes glistened. He reached out and shook Rob's hand. "Your father raised a good man. You tell him I said that." "Yes, sir." Rob walked back to his seat. He sat down, he put his earbuds in, and for the first time in an hour, he exhaled. Andrea heard every word. She heard the boy's voice crack. She heard him say he was sorry. She heard Jacob say son, with a warmth that carried 24 years of protecting people he'd never meet. And something inside Andrea's chest cracked open another inch. She thought about her own son, Tyler, 24 years old, living in Boston, working at a consulting firm. They hadn't spoken in 3 months, not because of a fight, because Andrea kept telling him how to live his life, and Tyler finally told her that he couldn't breathe around her anymore. Those were his exact words. "Mom, I can't breathe around you." She'd been furious. She told herself he was ungrateful. She told herself he'd come back when he needed money. But sitting in this seat, at 37,000 feet watching a teenager show more grace than she'd shown in 58 years, she wondered for the first time if Tyler had been right. Maybe the problem wasn't the world. Maybe the problem was her. She reached for her phone again. Her hands were shaking. She opened a new text to Tyler and stared at the blank screen for a long time. Then she typed 2 words. "I'm sorry." Her thumb hovered over the send button. She pressed it. The message sat there with a small red exclamation point. No signal. Airplane mode. The apology was trapped just like she was. An hour into the flight, Jane Boston made her move. She unbuckled her seatbelt, walked to row 2, and leaned down beside Jacob's seat. "Mr. Cash, my name is Jane Boston. I'm an attorney based in D.C. I specialize in civil rights law." Jacob looked at her with careful eyes. "Ma'am, I want to be straightforward with you. I recorded what happened before takeoff, the entire incident. I didn't do it to exploit the situation. I did it because in my experience these moments get rewritten by the people who cause them, and I didn't want that to happen to you." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "How much did you get?" "Everything. From the moment she called for security to the captain's salute." Jacob nodded slowly. "And what are you planning to do with it?" "Nothing. Not without your permission. That's why I'm here. This is your story, your experience. I won't share it, post it, or use it in any way unless you tell me you want me to." Jacob looked at her for a long time, long enough that Jane began to wonder if she'd overstepped. Then he spoke. "My wife is going to find out about this one way or another. She reads me like a book. I'd rather she hear it from the truth than from someone else's version of it. So you want me to hold on to the video. I want you to keep it safe. And if the time comes when it needs to be seen, I trust you to make that call." Jane reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a business card. She placed it on his tray table. "My cell is on there. Call me anytime, day or night." "Thank you, Jane." "Thank you, Mr. Cash, for how you handled that. I've been doing this work for over 2 decades, and I've never seen anyone respond to something like that with the kind of composure you showed." "I've had practice," Jacob said. And the way he said it carried so much weight that Jane had to turn away for a moment to collect herself. She went back to her seat. Gerald was watching her. "You talked to him," Gerald said. "I did. And he's the real thing, Gerald, the kind of man they don't make enough of." Gerald nodded. "I could have told you that from here." The flight was halfway to San Diego when Andrea unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. She didn't look at anyone. She walked toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin with her head down, her arms crossed, her designer blazer wrinkled from sitting so rigidly for 2 hours. She locked the door behind her and stared at herself in the small rectangular mirror. The face staring back wasn't the face she recognized. The woman she knew was polished, confident, certain. This woman looked hollowed out. Her mascara had smudged. Her lipstick had faded. The lines around her mouth looked deeper than they had this morning. She turned on the faucet and let cold water run over her wrists, an old trick her mother taught her for calming nerves. Her mother, Helen, a woman who grew up in Savannah, Georgia, who once told a 12-year-old Andrea that certain people were different and that it was smart to be cautious. She didn't use slurs. She didn't march with signs. She did something quieter and more corrosive. She planted seeds of suspicion in her daughter's mind and let them grow in darkness, unchecked and unchallenged, until they became the architecture of how Andrea saw the world. Andrea gripped the edges of the tiny sink. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in memory, she asked herself a question she had never once considered. What if Mom was wrong? The thought was so foreign, so destabilizing, that her knees buckled. She sat down on the closed toilet lid and pressed her palms against her temples. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps. Not a panic attack, something worse, a reckoning. She sat there for 7 minutes, long enough that Grace knocked on the door. "Ma'am, are you all right in there?" "I'm fine." Her voice was hoarse. She cleared her throat. "I'll be out in a moment." She washed her face. She dried it with a paper towel. She looked at herself one more time. Then she unlocked the door and walked back to her seat. When she sat down, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On Jacob's tray table beside his journal and coffee cup, there was a photograph, small wallet size tucked into the journal's front cover. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could make out the shapes. A man in uniform. A woman beside him. 2 children. A family. He has children, she thought. He has a family who loves him and waits for him and worries about him every time he gets on a plane. Just like my family, just like Tyler. The crack inside her widened, and this time she didn't try to hold it together. She let the tears come, silently, steadily, running down her cheeks and dropping onto her cream-colored blazer, leaving dark spots that she didn't bother wiping away. Gerald saw her crying from 3 rows back. He watched her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He bowed his head and said a prayer. Not for Jacob. Jacob was going to be fine. He prayed for Andrea, because Gerald Hutchins had learned something in 72 years that most people never figure out. He learned that the people who cause the most pain are usually the ones carrying the most, and that healing doesn't start with punishment. It starts with breaking. Andrea Whitmore was breaking, and that Gerald believed was the beginning. 2 hours and 43 minutes into the flight, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Gusto. We're beginning our initial descent into San Diego. Current weather is 72 degrees and clear. We'll be on the ground in approximately 35 minutes. I want to thank you all for flying with us today. It has been my genuine honor to command this flight." He paused, and then he added something that wasn't in the standard script. "I'd also like to remind everyone that the person sitting next to you has a story you don't know, a life you haven't lived, and a value that doesn't require your approval. Be kind to each other, not because it's easy, because it's right." The intercom clicked off. The cabin was silent. Then from somewhere in the back of the plane and coach, from a passenger who had heard nothing about what happened in first class, but felt the captain's words land in their chest like a heartbeat, someone started clapping. 1 person, then 2, then 10, then the entire aircraft erupted in applause, not because they knew the story, but because they recognized the truth when they heard it. Jacob looked out the window. The California coastline was emerging below, golden and vast. He closed his journal, he capped his pen, and he let himself feel something he rarely allowed: pride. Not in what he had endured today, but in who he still was after all of it. The wheels touched down in San Diego at 11:47 a.m. Pacific time. The brakes engaged, the engines reversed, and the plane rolled slowly toward the gate carrying 47 passengers, 6 crew members, and one truth that none of them would ever be able to unlearn. The seatbelt sign turned off with a chime. Passengers stood up reaching for bags, checking phones, returning to the rhythms of ordinary life. But nothing about this flight had been ordinary. And as Jacob Cash reached for his duffel in the overhead bin, the same bag that Andrea Whitmore had thrown into the aisle 3 hours ago, he felt a hand on his arm. He turned. It was Andrea. She was standing in the aisle, her face raw, her eyes swollen, her carefully constructed armor completely gone. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't know how to say this," she whispered. Jacob waited. "I was wrong." Her voice broke on the second word. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything, and I know that saying sorry doesn't fix it. I know that. But I need you to hear me say it, because if I walk off this plane without telling you, I will never be able to live with myself." The cabin had gone quiet again. Every passenger still in their seat was watching. Grace was watching from the galley door. Marcus was watching from the front. Even Rob Donovan, standing in the aisle with his backpack, had frozen. Jacob looked at Andrea for a long time. He studied her face the way he studied everything, with patience and precision. He saw the shame, the fear, the desperate, clumsy attempt at something she had probably never done before in her life. He didn't smile. He didn't reach out to comfort her. He didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. But he gave her something far more valuable than forgiveness. He gave her the truth. "You hurt me today," Jacob said. "I want you to know that. I've been hurt in a lot of ways by a lot of people, and I've survived all of it. I'll survive this too. But the fact that I can take it doesn't mean it's okay to give it. You understand that?" Andrea nodded, tears streaming. "I don't know what made you see a threat when you looked at me. But whatever it is, it didn't start on this plane. It started a long time ago. And if you're serious about being sorry, then don't apologize to me. Change. Go home and change. That's the only apology that means anything." Andrea's knees nearly gave out. She grabbed the headrest of 1B to steady herself. She looked at Jacob one more time, and what she saw wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was something she didn't deserve but received anyway. Grace. She turned and walked off the plane without another word, her heels clicking down the jetway, slower than when she arrived, quieter, like a woman walking into a life she didn't recognize anymore. Jacob watched her go. Then he slung his duffel over his shoulder and stepped into the aisle. Gerald Hutchins was still sitting in row 5 when Jacob stepped into the aisle. He hadn't stood up yet, hadn't reached for his bag. He was watching Jacob the way a man watches something sacred, with stillness, with reverence, with the understanding that what he was witnessing didn't need his commentary. It needed his attention. But then Jacob walked past his row, and Gerald couldn't help himself. He reached out and touched Jacob's arm, lightly, the way his father used to touch people when he wanted them to stop and listen. Jacob stopped. He looked down at the old man in the aisle seat. Gerald's eyes were red. His handkerchief was balled up in his fist. His glasses sat crooked on his nose. "Son," Gerald said. His voice was rough-weathered by 7 decades and carrying the kind of authority that only comes from a life fully lived. "I need to say something to you." "Yes, sir." "I was 9 years old in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. My father was a minister. We marched, we got spit on, we got called things no child should ever hear, and my daddy, he stood there just like you stood there today. Didn't yell, didn't fight, just stood. And I spent my whole life trying to be as strong as he was." Gerald's voice cracked. "Today you reminded me of him, and I want to thank you for that, because I was starting to forget what that kind of strength looked like." Jacob set his bag down. He didn't care that the aisle was full of people waiting to deplane. He didn't care that someone behind him sighed impatiently. He knelt down beside Gerald's seat, so they were eye to eye. "What was your father's name?" Jacob asked. "Reverend Charles Hutchins." "Reverend Charles Hutchins," Jacob repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Your father was a hero, and based on what I can see, his son turned out the same way." Gerald grabbed Jacob's hand and held it. 2 men. 2 generations, 2 completely different lives that had just intersected at the exact moment they both needed it. Gerald squeezed his hand so hard, his knuckles went white, and then he let go. "Go give that speech in San Diego," Gerald said. "And you tell those veterans that the fight's not over, but the good guys are still standing." Jacob picked up his bag and walked off the plane. The jetway felt longer than it should have. His left knee ached from the descent the way it always did. The shrapnel shifted with pressure changes, a souvenir from Helmand Province that he'd carry to his grave. He adjusted the strap on his duffel and walked into the terminal. San Diego International was bright and loud, families hugging at the gate, business travelers rushing toward baggage claim, a kid waving a handmade sign for his grandmother. Normal life. The kind of life Jacob had spent 24 years protecting so that people could take it for granted. He didn't resent that. He loved it. The whole point of sacrifice was so that ordinary people could have ordinary days. His phone reconnected the moment he switched off airplane mode. 17 notifications, 6 texts from Denise, 2 missed calls from the conference organizer, and 1 voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. He checked Denise's texts first. "Landed yet? Text me when you're on the ground." "Jacob Thomas Cash, I know you see your phone. I'm making your favorite tonight when you get home. Call me." "I love you. Don't forget to eat something. If you don't answer in 10 minutes, I'm calling the airline." He smiled. The first unguarded smile since before boarding. He typed back quickly. "Landed safe. Love you. Talk soon." Then he pocketed his phone and headed for the exit. The conference wasn't until the next morning, but the organizer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morales, had arranged a welcome dinner that evening. Jacob had planned to check into his hotel, take a long shower, and decompress before meeting anyone. He needed the quiet. His body was here, but his mind was still on that plane, still hearing Andrea's voice, still feeling the weight of that salute. He found a taxi outside baggage claim and gave the driver the hotel address. As the car merged onto the freeway, Jacob pulled out his journal. He opened it to the page from this morning. Steady, patience, dignity. Still here, still standing. He turned to the next page and wrote something new, something he hadn't expected to write. She cried. and I think it was real." He stared at those words for a long time. Then he closed the journal and watched the city pass by. What Jacob didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the story of Flight 4721 was already moving beyond the walls of that aircraft. While he was sitting in the back of a taxi in San Diego, the passengers who had shared that flight were scattering across the city, and every single one of them was carrying the story with them. Rob Donovan called his mother from the gate. He didn't text. He called. His mother, Linda, answered on the first ring. "Rob, what happened?" "You scared me with those texts." "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." He told her everything, start to finish. The accusation, the thrown bag, the security officers, the military ID, the captain's salute, Jacob's words, the apology on deplaning. He talked for 12 minutes without stopping, and his mother didn't interrupt once. When he finished, the line was quiet. "Mom," Linda Donovan was crying. "That man, that poor man." "He wasn't poor, Mom. He was the strongest person I've ever seen." "I need you to do something for me, Robert." "What?" "When you start school in January, I want you to remember this day. I want you to remember what you saw and what you felt. And I want you to be the kind of man who stands up when something like that happens, not the kind who watches." "I will, Mom, I promise." "Your father would be so proud of you for walking up to that man. You know that, right?" "I know. Call me tonight. I want to hear your voice again." "Yes, ma'am." Rob hung up and walked toward the shuttle that would take him to his aunt's house. He was 18 years old, and the world looked different to him than it had 6 hours ago. Not worse, not better, just more honest. And he wasn't sure yet whether that was a gift or a burden. Across the terminal, Jane Boston was standing at the rental car counter, her phone pressed between her ear and her shoulder while she signed paperwork. "David, listen to me. I have video of something that happened on my flight this morning, a racial profiling incident, first class. A white woman accused a black Navy SEAL veteran of stealing his seat. She threw his bag. She called security. And the pilot came out and saluted the man in front of the entire cabin. David Chen was Jane's law partner. He'd known her for 15 years and had learned to take her seriously when her voice hit a certain register. It was hitting that register now. How long is the video? 14 minutes. 14 minutes of what exactly? Everything. The accusation, the confrontation, the captain's salute, the woman's face when she realized what she'd done, all of it. David was silent for 3 seconds. "Jane, that's not just a video. That's a case." "I know. What does the veteran want?" "He told me to keep it safe. He said if the time comes, he trusts me to make the call." "That's not a yes and it's not a no." "I know that too. I'm not going to push him, but I wanted you to know it exists." "Does the airline know you recorded it?" "I don't know. I don't care. I was on a commercial aircraft. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy in a public cabin." "The airline might not see it that way." "The airline doesn't get to rewrite what happened. I watched a woman try to have a decorated veteran removed from a seat he paid for because he was black. If the airline has a problem with me documenting that, they can take it up with the Constitution." David exhaled. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "I never let anything go, David. You know that." "Yeah, I do. That's why I made you partner." Jane hung up and took her rental car keys. She had a hotel room booked near the conference center because she was in San Diego for a separate legal symposium. But her mind wasn't on depositions and case law anymore. It was on a 14-minute video and a man named Jacob Cash who carried himself like a king and asked for nothing. At 1:17 p.m., Gerald Hutchins sat in the San Diego airport food court with a cup of soup he wasn't eating. His carry-on was at his feet. His phone was on the table. He was supposed to be visiting his daughter Linda, who lived in La Jolla with her husband and 2 kids. She was picking him up in 20 minutes. But Gerald wasn't thinking about his daughter or his grandchildren or the soup getting cold in front of him. He was thinking about writing something. Gerald had been a high school history teacher for 41 years. He taught American history to 11th graders in Richmond, Virginia. And he believed with everything in him that history wasn't just something that happened in the past. It was something that happened every day, in every interaction on every airplane and bus and street corner, where human beings decided who deserved respect and who didn't. He pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket, the same kind of notepad he'd used to write lesson plans for 4 decades, and he started writing. Not a lesson plan, something else, something personal. Today I watched a man get treated like he didn't belong. And then I watched him prove that he belonged more than anyone else on that plane. He wrote for 15 minutes. When his daughter called to say she was at the curb, he tucked the notepad away and grabbed his bag. But the words kept coming even after he stopped writing. They followed him to the car through dinner, through bedtime stories with his grandchildren. They were still there when he lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, and they were still there when he woke up the next morning and knew exactly what he had to do with them. At 4:22 p.m., Jacob Cash sat on the edge of his hotel bed with his phone in his hand. He had showered. He had changed. He had done 50 push-ups on the hotel room floor because his body needed to move and his mind needed to focus. And now he was doing the thing he had been putting off since landing. He called Denise. She answered immediately. "There he is. I was about ready to fly out there myself. Sorry, long flight." Long flight as in turbulence or long flight as in something happened. Jacob paused. She heard it. She always heard it. "Jacob, what happened?" It wasn't a question. It was a command. 27 years of marriage had given Denise Cash the ability to read her husband's silences the way other people read books. She knew his breathing. She knew the difference between a tired pause and a troubled one. This was troubled. "Something happened on the plane," Jacob said. "I'm fine. Nobody got hurt, but I need to tell you." "Tell me." He told her, all of it, the woman, the accusation, the thrown bag, the security officers, the captain, the salute, the teenager, the lawyer, the apology. He left nothing out because he and Denise didn't do that. They had made a pact in the early years of his military career when deployments were long and secrets were easy. No lies, no omissions. Everything on the table, no matter how hard. When he finished, the line was quiet for a long time. 15 seconds. 20. 30. "Denise, I'm here." Her voice was different now. Tight. Controlled, the voice she used when she was so angry she didn't trust herself to speak freely. "I'm here and I'm listening and I'm trying very hard not to get in my car and drive to the airport." "Baby." "Don't baby me, Jacob. A woman threw your bag, the bag you carried through Kandahar. It's just a bag." "It is not just a bag. It's your bag. And she touched it because she decided you didn't deserve to sit in a seat you paid for. A seat that someone gave you because they respect what you've done for this country." "Denise." "No. Let me be angry, Jacob. You won't be angry, so I'll be angry for both of us. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked." He didn't argue. He couldn't, because she was right. That was exactly how it worked. He absorbed the blows, and she processed the rage. It was their system. Imperfect, functional, built on 27 years of loving each other through things that most couples couldn't imagine. "The captain saluted you?" Denise asked after a long pause. "Yes. Full salute. Full salute, right there in the aisle." "What was his name?" "Gusto. Captain Agustin Gusto, Air Force veteran, flew C-130s. Denise was quiet again, but this time the silence had a different texture. Softer, warmer. "I wish I could have seen that," she whispered. "I wish I could have been there to see someone honor you like that." "You honor me every day, Denise, every single day." She broke. The controlled voice shattered, and she cried the way she only cried when Jacob was on the other end of the phone and she couldn't hold him. Loud, honest, unashamed sobs that carried 27 years of worry, pride, love, and fury. "Come home safe," she said through her tears. "Always," he replied. They stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes. They talked about the conference, about the speech he was giving tomorrow, about their daughter Maya, who was finishing nursing school in Philadelphia, about their son David, who had just been accepted into officer candidate school, following in his father's footsteps. They talked about normal things because normal things were the antidote to the kind of day Jacob had. When they hung up, Jacob sat in the silence of his hotel room for a long time. Then he picked up his journal and wrote, "She wanted to come fight for me. That woman would walk through fire for me, and I would burn the whole world down for her." He closed the journal, he put on a clean shirt, and he went to the welcome dinner. Dr. Patricia Morales met him in the lobby of the restaurant. She was 55, sharp-eyed, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a low bun. She had spent 20 years working with the VA on veteran mental health, and she had invited Jacob to be the keynote speaker because of a letter he'd written to a veterans magazine 3 years ago. In that letter, Jacob described his own battle with PTSD, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the marriage that nearly collapsed under the weight of things he couldn't talk about. The letter went viral in the military community. It was raw, honest, and broke every unwritten rule about what warriors were supposed to admit, and it saved lives. Patricia had received emails from 17 veterans who said they sought help after reading Jacob's words. 17 people who were still alive because one man found the courage to be vulnerable. "Jacob," Patricia said, shaking his hand, "thank you for coming. I know this is a big ask." It's not a big ask, it's an honor. How was your flight? Jacob hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but Patricia caught it. That bad. Let's just say it was educational. Patricia studied his face. She didn't push. She was a psychologist. She knew when to press and when to wait. Well, you're here now, and tomorrow you're going to change some lives. I'm sure of it. Dinner was quiet and warm. 8 people around a table, all of them working in veteran services. A social worker from Phoenix, a chaplain from Fort Bragg, a nurse practitioner from Walter Reed. People who understood what Jacob had lived because they spent every day picking up the pieces of people who had lived it too. Jacob didn't mention what happened on the plane, not once. He listened, he asked questions. He laughed at the chaplain's terrible jokes and complimented the nurse practitioner on a program she'd developed for combat trauma recovery. He was present, engaged, generous with his attention. But when he got back to his hotel room at 9:47 p.m., he sat on the bed and stared at the wall for 20 minutes without moving. The day was catching up to him, not the anger, not the humiliation, something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of his bones where the shrapnel and the memories and the losses were all tangled together. He thought about Specialist Kevin Torres, 23 years old, killed by an IED in Fallujah in 2007. Jacob was 10 feet away when it happened. He carried Kevin's body to the medevac helicopter. He told Kevin he was going to be okay. He lied, and he had been carrying that lie for 19 years. He thought about Senior Chief Mark Patterson, his best friend, his brother in every way that mattered. Mark put a gun in his mouth in 2014, 2 years after they both came home. No note, no warning, just a phone call from Mark's wife at 3 a.m. and a silence that never ended. He thought about the 14 men he served with who didn't come home. Their names were tattooed on his left forearm, hidden under his shirt sleeve. 14 names in small black letters. He touched them every morning when he got dressed, every single morning, like a prayer. Andrea Whitmore had looked at him and seen a threat. She had looked at a man carrying 14 names on his arm and decided he didn't belong. Jacob reached for his journal one last time. He opened it and found the page where he'd written about Andrea's tears. Below it he added one sentence. "Tomorrow I speak for the ones who can't." He closed the journal. He turned off the light. And for the first time in years, Jacob Cash fell asleep without a single nightmare. Jacob woke at 04:30. No alarm. The room was dark and still, and his body was already moving before his mind caught up. He swung his legs off the bed, pressed his bare feet against the cold hotel floor, and sat there for a moment. His left knee throbbed. It always throbbed in the morning. The shrapnel's way of saying good morning, reminding him that the war never fully let go, no matter how many years passed. He reached for his left forearm and pressed his thumb against the names. 14 of them. Small black letters under the skin. Torres, Patterson, Davis, Ramos, Colton, Briggs. He didn't need to read them. He knew them by touch the way a blind man knows Braille. Every morning. Every single morning. A ritual as sacred as breathing. He stood up, dropped to the floor, and did 50 push-ups, then 50 more. His body protested, but his mind quieted. And that was the trade he had been making with himself for 26 years. Pain for peace. Discipline for clarity. He showered, he shaved, he put on a dark navy suit that Denise had picked out for him 2 weeks ago. She'd held it up in the department store and said, "This one. This is the one that says you mean business, but you're still the man I married." He smiled at the memory. She was always right about these things. About most things, if he was honest. He knotted his tie, checked himself in the mirror, and reached for his journal. He opened it to a fresh page and stared at the blank white space. Today was the speech. 300 veterans in a conference hall, waiting to hear from a man who had walked through the same fire they had. A man who understood the nightmares and the guilt and the silence and the rage. A man who had nearly lost everything to the war inside his own head and had clawed his way back. He wrote one line, "Tell the truth. That's all they need." He closed the journal, tucked it into his bag, and left the room. The conference was at the San Diego Convention Center. Dr. Patricia Morales met him in the lobby at 7:45, 15 minutes before the keynote session. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking. Black, no sugar. She'd done her research. "How'd you sleep?" she asked. "Like the dead," Jacob said. "Best sleep I've had in years." "Good, because there are 312 people in that ballroom who have been waiting 6 months to hear you speak." "No pressure," Patricia smiled. "All the pressure. But you can handle it. I've read your letter 100 times. You were born for this. I was born to fight. This part I'm still learning." That's exactly why they need to hear you, Jacob, because you're still learning too. They walked toward the ballroom together. Jacob could hear the murmur of the crowd through the closed doors. 300 veterans, men and women who had served in every branch, every conflict, every theater of operation from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Some were in wheelchairs. Some had prosthetic limbs. Some looked perfectly whole on the outside, but carried wounds so deep no surgeon could reach them. Jacob knew. He was one of them. Patricia stepped to the podium first. She introduced Jacob with a brief biography. His years of service, his deployments, his decorations, his work with veteran mental health since retiring. The audience listened respectfully, but Jacob could feel something in the room. An energy, a tension. These weren't civilians being polite. These were warriors sizing up another warrior, waiting to see if he was the real thing. Patricia finished and turned to him. "Mr. Cash, the floor is yours." Jacob stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the podium. He placed his hands on either side of it and looked out at 300 faces. Some young, some old, some hard, some broken. All of them watching him with the kind of focus that only people who have survived the unsurvivable can sustain. He didn't start with his prepared remarks. He didn't start with statistics or program descriptions or policy recommendations. He started with the truth. "Yesterday," Jacob said, "a woman on my flight tried to have me removed from first class because I'm black." The room went dead silent. She looked at me and decided I didn't belong. She called security. She threw my bag into the aisle. She told the crew I was a threat. And when the officers checked my ID and saw that I was a retired Navy SEAL with 24 years of service, she still didn't back down. She stood in that aisle and said, "Look at him," as if the color of my skin was evidence of a crime. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I'm telling you this, not because I want sympathy. I've had worse days than yesterday. Most of you have too. I'm telling you this because that woman's face, the way she looked at me, reminded me of something I've been running from for a long time. He paused. The silence was thick enough to touch. It reminded me that the world we fought to protect doesn't always protect us back. A sound moved through the room. Not words, not applause, something deeper. A collective exhale, a recognition. 300 people who had served their country and come home to find that their country didn't always know what to do with them. "I lost 14 men in combat," Jacob continued. "Their names are on my arm." He unbuttoned his left sleeve and rolled it up. The tattoo was visible even from the back of the room. 14 names in 2 columns of small black letters. I carry them every day. Every morning I wake up, I touch their names, and I ask myself if I'm living a life that's worthy of the fact that I'm still here and they're not. He looked down at the podium for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were glistening. My best friend, Senior Chief Mark Patterson, survived 3 deployments, made it home in one piece, had a wife, a daughter, a house with a yard, and 2 years after we came back, he put a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. No note, no warning, just gone. The room was weeping. Not dramatically, not performatively. The quiet, jaw-clenched weeping of people who had their own Mark Pattersons, their own names they carried, their own 3 a.m. phone calls that changed everything. "I almost followed him," Jacob said. The words landed like a bomb. 6 months after Mark died, I sat in my garage with my service weapon, and I thought about it. I sat there for 2 hours. Denise was asleep upstairs. My kids were in their beds. And I sat in that garage, and I told myself that the world would be easier without me in it. He gripped the podium. His knuckles went white. But then I thought about Mark's daughter. She was 7 years old when he died. 7. And I remembered her face at the funeral standing next to that casket, in a dress that was too big for her, holding a teddy bear, and asking her mother when Daddy was coming back. And I put the gun down, not because I was brave, because I was afraid of what my absence would do to the people who loved me. He looked directly into the audience. "That's why I'm here today, because I put the gun down. And I need every single one of you to hear me when I say this. Your life is not yours alone. It belongs to every person who loves you, every person who served beside you, and every person who will never meet you, but whose life will be changed because you stayed." The first person stood up, a woman in the 3rd row, late 40s, army jacket. She didn't clap, she just stood. Then the man beside her, then a row behind them, then another. Within 30 seconds, every person in that ballroom was on their feet, not applauding, standing, bearing witness, honoring the truth the way warriors honor the things that matter most. With their bodies, with their presence, with the simple act of rising. Jacob stood at the podium and let it wash over him. He didn't cry. Not yet. But his chin trembled and his hands shook, and he held onto that podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He spoke for 47 more minutes. He talked about PTSD, about the nightmares that didn't stop just because the deployment was over, about the marriages that buckled under the weight of secrets, about the VA system, its failures and its heroes, about the therapist who saved his life by teaching him to write in a journal instead of swallowing everything until it poisoned him from the inside out. And he talked about yesterday, about the captain who saluted him, about the teenager who walked up to his seat and said he was sorry, about the old man who held his hand and told him about his father, about the woman who apologized with tears running down her face. He told them all of it because they deserved the full story, not just the pain, but the redemption, not just the wound, but the healing. When he finished, the standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. Patricia Morales was crying openly. The chaplain from last night's dinner had his head bowed. And somewhere in the back of the room, a 26-year-old Marine who had been thinking about ending his life for 3 weeks sat in his chair with tears streaming down his face and made a decision. He was going to call the crisis line, tonight, because if Jacob Cash could put the gun down, so could he. His name was Corporal Diego Alvarez, and Jacob would never know his name, but that was the point. You never know whose life you save when you tell the truth. After the speech, Jacob was surrounded. Veterans shaking his hand, grabbing his shoulder, pulling him into hugs that were too tight and lasted too long and meant everything. Men who hadn't cried in decades were crying in front of a stranger because he gave them permission to break. But the moment that stopped Jacob cold came 40 minutes after the speech, when a woman in her 30s approached him with a little girl on her hip. "Mr. Cash." "Yes, ma'am." "My name is Sarah Patterson." Jacob's world stopped. "Mark was my husband." He couldn't speak. His throat closed, his vision blurred. He looked at the woman standing in front of him and saw the ghost of his best friend in the line of her jaw, in the way she held herself, in the steadiness of her eyes. "And this," Sarah said, shifting the child on her hip, "is Emma. She's 7 now. She doesn't remember him, but I show her pictures every day and I tell her that her daddy was the bravest man I ever knew." Jacob reached out and touched Emma's tiny hand. The little girl looked at him with wide brown eyes and smiled. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that this man had carried her father's memory like a stone in his chest for 9 years. She just saw a tall man in a nice suit who looked like he needed a friend. "Hi," Emma said. "Hi, sweetheart," Jacob whispered. His voice broke completely. The stoic wall, the discipline, the 24 years of training that taught him to control every emotion, all of it crumbled in the face of a 7-year-old girl's smile. Sarah put her free hand on Jacob's arm. "Mark talked about you all the time. You were his brother. I want you to know that whatever happened between when he came home and when he left, it wasn't your fault. I spent a long time blaming everyone, the military, the VA, myself, you. But it wasn't anyone's fault. He was sick, and we didn't have the tools to save him." "I should have known," Jacob said. "I should have seen it." "You couldn't have. I lived with him, and I didn't see it. The disease hides. That's what it does. But what you just did in there, telling your story, telling his story, that's how we fight it. That's how we make sure the next Mark Patterson gets the help he needs." Jacob pulled Sarah into a hug. He held her and Emma for a long time, right there in the middle of a conference hall full of strangers, and he wept. Not the controlled, dignified tears of a man protecting his image. The deep, shaking, unstoppable tears of a man who had been holding something for 9 years and finally found a safe place to set it down. Patricia Morales watched from across the room. She didn't approach. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there with her hand over her heart, understanding that what she was witnessing was exactly why she had spent 20 years doing this work. The video from Flight 4721 was posted 3 weeks later. Jane Boston called Jacob on a Thursday evening and told him that the airline had quietly noted the incident in their records, but had taken no public action. No apology, no policy change, no acknowledgement that a passenger had been racially profiled on their aircraft. Jacob listened. Then he said 5 words. "Let the world see it." Jane posted the video on her firm's social media accounts at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. By noon, it had 200,000 views. By Saturday evening, it had crossed 4 million. By the following Wednesday, every major news outlet in America had covered the story. The video showed everything. Andrea's accusation, her words, the thrown bag, the security officers, Jacob's calm, the captain's salute, and the cabin's silence, that devastating sacred silence that said more than any words could. The response was overwhelming. Jacob's phone rang nonstop. Interview requests from CNN, NBC, The Washington Post, NPR. He turned down every single one. He didn't want fame. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a man who served his country and lived his life and loved his wife and honored his friends. That was enough. But the ripple effect couldn't be stopped. The airline issued a public apology within 72 hours of the video going viral. They announced a mandatory bias training program for all crew members and ground staff. They created a new protocol for handling in-flight discrimination complaints. And they offered Jacob a lifetime of first-class travel on any route they flew. He declined. Denise told him he was crazy. He told her he didn't want anything from them except their word that what happened to him would never happen to anyone else. Rob Donovan started a blog from his dorm room at San Diego State. He called it Row 4, named after the seat where he witnessed the incident. He wrote about prejudice, about privilege, about the things young people don't learn in school, but should. Within 6 months, it had 50,000 subscribers and had been featured in 3 national publications. His father, the police officer in Charlotte, read every post and shared every one. Gerald Hutchins published the essay he'd started writing at the airport food court. A local newspaper in Richmond ran it on the front page under the headline, "What I Saw at 37,000 Feet." The essay was reprinted in 11 newspapers across the country. Gerald received 400 letters from readers, many of them veterans, many of them people of color, many of them simply people who had been judged by their appearance and never had someone speak for them. He answered every single letter by hand. Captain Agustin Gusto retired from commercial aviation 4 months after the flight. At his retirement ceremony attended by 200 colleagues and family members, he was asked to name the proudest moment of his career. He didn't mention the Distinguished Flying Cross. He didn't mention the combat missions, or the emergency landings, or the 37 years of perfect safety records. He said, "The proudest moment of my career was the day I walked out of my cockpit and saluted a man who deserved it. And Andrea Whitmore. Andrea went home to Connecticut and didn't leave her house for 2 weeks. When the video went viral, she received death threats, hate mail, and calls for her to be fired from her position at a pharmaceutical company. She was fired. Her husband Richard didn't leave her, but something between them fractured in a way that would take years to repair. Her friends stopped calling. Her social circle, the one she had cultivated so carefully, evaporated overnight. But something else happened too. Something quieter. Something nobody posted about or covered or commented on." Andrea called her son. Tyler answered on the 4th ring. He hadn't heard from his mother in 3 months, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear from her now. But something in her voice stopped him from hanging up. "Tyler, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen." She told him everything. She told him about the plane, about Jacob, about the captain, about the video, and then she told him something she had never told anyone. She told him about her mother, Helen, about the things Helen whispered to her as a child, about the seeds that were planted in darkness and grew into the woman who stood in an airplane aisle and pointed at a stranger and said, "Someone like him doesn't belong here." "I was wrong," Andrea said. "About him. About a lot of things. About you." Tyler was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, do you know why I stopped calling? Because I was suffocating you. Because you were so sure you were right about everything that there was no room for anyone else to exist. Not me, not Dad, nobody, and I couldn't be around that anymore." "I know." "Do you really know? Or are you just saying that because the internet is angry at you?" Andrea closed her eyes. "I know, because a man on an airplane looked me in the eye and told me to go home and change. And for the first time in my life, I listened." Tyler didn't forgive her that day. Forgiveness isn't a phone call. It's a process. It's showing up differently day after day until the people you hurt begin to trust that the change is real. Andrea started therapy. She joined a community dialogue group on race and bias. She volunteered at a Veterans Outreach Center in Hartford. She didn't do it for publicity. She didn't do it for redemption. She did it because Jacob Cash told her the only apology that means anything is change. So she changed. 11 months after Flight 4721, Jacob Cash stood in his backyard in Norfolk, Virginia, grilling steaks on a Sunday afternoon. Denise was inside making potato salad. Maya was home from nursing school. David was on leave from officer training. The whole family together. The sun was warm. The grass was green. The world for this one afternoon was exactly as it should be. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Cash, this is Andrea Whitmore. I know I don't deserve your time, but I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the Hartford Veterans Center for 8 months. Last week I helped a young Marine named Diego Alvarez find housing and employment. He told me that he almost ended his life last year, but he heard a speech that changed his mind. A speech by a man named Jacob Cash. I thought you should know. You saved his life. And in a way you'll probably never understand. You saved mine too. Jacob read the message twice. He set his phone down on the patio table. He looked at his family through the kitchen window. Denise laughing at something Maya said. David stealing a piece of cornbread from the counter. Ordinary life, sacred life, the life he fought for, the life he almost gave up. He picked up his phone and typed back 2 words. Thank you. Then he closed his eyes, tilted his face toward the sun, and let himself feel the full weight of being alive. The shrapnel in his knee, the names on his arm, the wife in his kitchen, the children in his house, the strangers whose lives he had touched without ever knowing it. All of it. Every ounce of pain and beauty and loss and love that made up the story of Jacob Thomas Cash. He opened his journal one last time. He turned past the pages filled with words from the hardest and most important week of his life. He found a blank page, and he wrote the last entry. I am not what they see when they look at me. I am not what they assume. I am not their fear. I am not their prejudice. I am a husband, a father, a warrior, a survivor. I am the son of parents who taught me to stand tall. I am the brother of 14 men who gave everything. I am still here. I am still standing, and I will never, ever stop. He closed the journal. He capped his pen. He walked inside to be with his family. And that was enough. That was everything.